just double check that. I understand you've been given information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses and evidence.
Yes.
And I think we're just getting him now. He won't have heard your names before, so that's why I'm sort of hesitating a little bit. He'll catch up, I'm sure. Could I please ask for the Hansard record for your full names and the capacity in which you appear?
Simone Leyden. I'm the CEO and co-founder of the Unicorn Foundation. We look after patients with neuroendocrine cancer.
Welcome.
John Cannings. I appear today as a patient.
Welcome.
Richard Vines. I appear as co-founder and director of Rare Cancers Australia.
Welcome. Thank you for coming today and for your submissions. I'd like to invite you all to make an opening statement, and then we'll ask you some questions.
We had the discussion of who would go first, so I'll
go.
take that. Okay. Thank you to everyone involved in today's inquiry and for the opportunity to speak today. When my sister Kate was given the devastating diagnosis of terminal, incurable neuroendocrine cancer at the age of 30, our world was torn apart. Little was known about her disease, and she, like others in her position, were largely neglected by the health system as they fell into the too hard basket. Kate had the means and the ability to visit experts around the world, from New York to Sweden, and the best care and specialists we found were right here in our own backyard. As founding member of the International Neuroendocrine Cancer Alliance, we see firsthand the health systems around the world, and the consensus is, if you have neuroendocrine cancer, you would prefer to live in Australia. We have a highly regarded and respected healthcare system, and the TGA, PBAC and MSAC do an honourable job in providing universal healthcare. However, we need to evolve our system to keep up with the advancements in technologies and the paradigm shift towards personalised medicine. In the case of an incredibly effective treatment for neuroendocrine cancer patients, peptide receptor radionuclide therapy, or PRRT, which unfortunately is only used as last resort, is not pharma-backed or sponsored, and thus, despite incredible success in its use in the last 20 years at Peter Mac amongst other institutions, without the money to put towards a submission and clinical trials, it is still considered experimental. It falls to our small charity that receives no funding and relies on fundraising to invest in a phase 2 randomised clinical trial, which the results are eagerly awaited from around the globe. This may help with a submission through either MSAC, who surprisingly considers this therapy a device, or hopefully BPAC, in the unlikely event that we ever get enough money to put forward a submission. Our system is not broken, but clearly this shows it definitely needs improvement, and we should strive when it comes to cancer and the lives of our fellow Australians. In order to move forward, we must work together. It should not fall just to government or its departments. It cannot fall just to pharma to spend billions on R&D. Specialists need to be able to treat patients with the most appropriate treatments, no matter what the cost. And we cannot dismiss the intelligence of today's cancer patient and the access they have to information, whether correct or incorrect. We need to share the risk when it comes to investment in R&D, and we need to build the evidence and have effective registries, all things that I think we've all been speaking about today. We need to maintain the highest standards for our citizens, and we need safety standards for our citizens, and we need greater collaboration between all stakeholders and transparency in the decision-making process. In doing so, we will enjoy the ultimate reward, a healthy community, and not losing our loved ones too early.
Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, Senators, and thank you for staging this inquiry, and thank you also for allowing this session where we can focus on the plight of Australians with rare or less common cancers. As Professor David Thomas of the Garvan Institute said last year about rare cancers, that they have suffered from systematic neglect for the last 20 years in Australia. The 44,000 Australians who will be diagnosed this year with one of over 200 rare or less common cancers, and the 24,000 who will die deserve this attention. Recently, I met with one of your colleagues in this place to discuss access to medicines for rare cancer patients, and he sat me down and said, "Richard, of course it's all about the money." Took a breath, sat back, looked satisfied, and he was absolutely and completely wrong. This issue is not just about money, it's about compassion, it's about hope, it's It's about quality of life, it's about quantity of life, it's about time with children, it's about time with family, and it's about dignity and grace at the end of life. It's about how we as a community care for those amongst us who are most vulnerable. Perhaps most critically, it's also about how we empower our cancer physicians to care for us. They're the ones we trust with our lives, no one else. In 2006, my wife Kate was on extremely high pain medication for metastatic tumours. Her cancer is both rare and not considered responsive to chemotherapy. Her oncologist, Ben Brady, proposed that she try chemo, one normally used in breast cancer, not Kate's cancer. It worked, and she is here today, pain-free, and spending her time helping other patients at RCA. My point is that Ben knew Kate, her disease and his options, and he was simply the right and only person to make the call on her treatment. It was Ben, incidentally, some 5 years later, that suggested to Kate she establish Rare Cancers Australia, as the system was so heavily loaded against Australians with these cancers. Today, you will have heard and will hear arguments about money, systems, processes, statistics, but please remember that pharma industry executives and the public servants that you hear from, as passionate as they all are and as much as they care about Australians, and they do, and I know many of them, and they are not soulless bureaucrats or profit-seeking individuals. They care about how we get this done. So as much as that, they aren't the ones that have to sit down with a patient and tell them they have cancer, nor do they have to deliver the news to children or loved ones. So that's why today is so important, and it's so important for the community, and we thank you for it. And it's important that we talk about the role of physicians, how we bridge the gap between registration of medicines and the funding and availability of medicines, and to some extent how we look at more sustainable models for supplying and dealing with this issue in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senators. As you know, my name is John Cannings. I'm 58 years old. Last year I was diagnosed with inoperable metastatic stage 4 lung cancer. I'm not a smoker, never have been, and otherwise I am mentally and physically fit. Today there is no cure for my cancer. It's terminal. However, I still consider myself very fortunate. I have a rare cancer. Less than 4% of all lung cancer sufferers have my cancer. I have a genetic mutation known as anaplastic lymphoma kinase, or ALK. You will hear about it over the course of this inquiry. There is a specific drug which targets my cancer called crizotinib. What does this mean for me? I actually don't feel like a patient. I can take this drug orally in the form of a tablet twice a day, wherever I am, whether I'm travelling or out at dinner with family and friends. If I was on the current PBS listed alternative, pemetrexed, I would have to book in for an infusion at a public hospital or a cancer centre every 2 to 3 weeks. The side effects of the targeted therapy I'm on have been proven and shown to be much milder, much more manageable. I have some control over my life as a cancer sufferer. I have quality of life. And for me and for patients like me, that is what it's all about, quality of life. There is no plan B. At this point in time, I do not have other options. I'm still working, a bit less hours. I continue to carry out the charitable and pro bono work that I've done during my professional career. It means an enormous amount to me in terms of both being emotional, psychological and physical, but it means an enormous difference to my wife and my family, who are my primary carers. There is a challenge with all this. Crizotinib, although it was approved at PBAC's last November meeting, it's still not listed on the PBS. It is not reimbursed. It's an expensive drug. I'm one of very few people, I think, in this community that can afford to purchase this drug. For every one of me, there are 30 or plus people who cannot. There's only around 340 people with my cancer in Australia today. There's only around 40 who are likely to be diagnosed each year. What we are after is a fair access scheme for people with rare cancers. It's not an expensive access scheme, but it is one which is truly remarkably different experience than the brutal, debilitating and exhausting process of normal cancer chemotherapy treatments. Thank you.
Thank you. Senators, anything?
Canning, if I can start with you first. I'm pleased you're getting that sort of treatment, but it seems to me that it's obviously an expensive treatment that's still not on the PBS, is that right?
Correct.
Has it slowed down your cancer?
I am what they call progression-free.
Right.
Senator, my primary tumours have reduced by more than 50%. There are no new tumours, no growth and no transfer, so they haven't migrated to other parts of my body at this stage.
Okay, well that's encouraging, obviously. What do you, and I put this to all of you, what do you, I mean I think that's why your evidence is so important, is that whilst you make up a very small proportion, a relatively small proportion of cancers, you make up half the deaths from cancer, and that's a challenge, isn't it, in terms of the way that the costs or the money angle, people say, well, you're a fairly small subset, but the impact is quite disproportionate. You've said, Mr. Vines, that there ought to be a site that more information given. Do you say that to patients or to be shared amongst medicos as well? I mean, there seems to be a lack of information about these types of cancers.
Yes, generally there is. The most common complaint of patients that we help and we support is that they're diagnosed extremely late. And as things stand with a lot of these cancers, the best hope is early diagnosis, but it's where there are 200 of them. Is that your question? No,
well, in part, but is the late diagnosis because of the nature of the cancer that the symptoms aren't readily apparent? Is that part of it?
I think, and what we see, obviously, with neuroendocrine cancers, on average, they're misdiagnosed for 5 to 7 years, and by the time they are diagnosed, it has spread to secondary. In over 50% of cases, it's spread. Generally, this is because their symptoms very much mirror common symptoms. So in our case, it's irritable bowel syndrome. I think everyone now has irritable bowel syndrome, or asthma-like symptoms, even anxiety. So what we are actually calling for, and we've sort of been working with Rare Cancers and other groups, and COSA and MOGA, is to look at an education program about rare cancers, and the fact that, I mean, our sort of saying is if you don't suspect it, you can't detect it. So we're really trying to roll out a sort of an education program, especially with GPs, to look at what, if someone's presenting in so many times with the same symptoms, to be able to just disqualify the more scary thing, which is the cancer. So it needs to be a national approach, and it needs to be across the board.
Just in relation to that, because that seems to be a practical approach that could make quite a difference. It's about that misdiagnosis, and early diagnosis obviously will make a big difference. What feedback have you had, say, from the AMA or for the Royal Australian College of GPs or other general practice groups that represent thousands of doctors in respect of this?
We did a survey, and we had about 700 responses to a GP survey that we then presented in a poster at ESMO, based on just what they knew about, in particular, neuroendocrine cancer, because that's what we were focusing on. And in some cases they did know it, but unfortunately at medical school it sort of took up maybe a paragraph in the last semester of their degree. It really was, there was no emphasis being put on it. A lot of the feedback we get is, well, we don't see it enough, so we don't really think about it, which is not really good enough when you've had a patient who then doesn't get diagnosed for so long.
If you could, perhaps on notice, just give details of the sorts of awareness that you think ought to be there for GPs, and what response you've had from the AMA, from colleges of GPs or whatever, just to see it's something that can be explored in terms of getting their responses in respect to that. You're saying that a bit of education can go a long way for early diagnosis.
Absolutely. We are, encouragingly, we're working with Medicare Local, which I don't think will be Medicare Local anymore, down in Victoria in the Northwest and Macedon Ranges, on a GP awareness program. And we're hoping that could be rolled out.
And there's the public and also the private system. Are private health funds more interested in this because they might have an interest in an earlier diagnosis as well?
Absolutely. I think everyone would be.
But if you could let me know about the communication you've had with private funds in addition to the public systems and of course the GPs. Are there any practical steps that you think should be taken, Mr. Mr. Vines, in respect of that?
Look, no, I think it's not something that we've yet focused on, to be honest.
Yeah.
We're more focused on those who are already diagnosed. But the common nature is, a sore shoulder is a sore shoulder until it's an osteosarcoma, and the way in which GPs operate, and it's going to be a long, hard process. And I think Simone's organisation has internationally they have a zebra as a logo, and the sign that they use, which they use very effectively, is just because it has hooves. Just because you hear hooves doesn't mean it's a horse. And I think we need to work very hard to get that kind of message out, that when people are returning to physicians with constant pain or constant symptoms, that it's maybe better to look a little deeper, because it might be a zebra.
Or a unicorn.
Or a unicorn.
Senator, could I just also make this statement? There's some very critical times in the patient experience and the patient journey. Obviously, diagnosis is one. There's generally a bit of a gap between diagnosis and then prognosis. The internet is awash with information. Some of it's good, most of it's terrible. And it's that critical period when the cancer patient and their immediate family want information. They want information as quickly as they can. But once they have prognosis, then it's about treatment. And for rare cancer sufferers, it's often the case that the treatment that the clinicians know or believe is the appropriate treatment is actually not affordable. It's not accessible because it's not been approved here by our PBAC. It may be registered with the TGA. In my case, with crizotinib, it's available in the US on private health insurance. It's available in the UK through their special drug fund. It's reimbursed in Canada, Germany and France. It's been around for some time. It's been 3 years since the company that makes it made its first submission.
I might put this to the PBAC. You're going to have to. I'm going to embarrass myself and asking how you spell it, so I can put it to the PBAC.
It's crizotinib. CRIZIT. OTINIB.
Sorry.
I'll do that. CRIZITONIB. Crizotinib.
Thank you.
And the fact is that if that is the right drug, and frankly it is the gold standard for ALK sufferers with my rare disease, and it's then not available to you, that is a huge chasm. And it's frankly unfair, in my opinion, to have only a very small percentage of our Australian population who can afford the drug get access.
40 out of 340.
Can I just ask a follow-on question there to Senator Xenophon? How much would it cost for this drug for those people that need it?
The drug currently is available for somewhere between $7,500 and $8,000 per month of treatment. The current reimbursed drug, which is the infusion-based drug, which has been around for 20 odd years, Permetrix said, it costs around $6,000 a year.
Right.
And that's what it's compared to.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
We run a fundraising scheme to help patients who can't afford it themselves under the banner of Sick or Treat, and we've helped patients with that. But as an example of its impact, one patient that I'm aware of in South Australia was in intensive care and had been there for several days before he was then prescribed crizotinib. And last time I spoke to him, he was keen to come over to give evidence today, but the timings didn't work out. But he's swimming on a daily basis, and he's up and about and fully functional, and and he's got everything to live for, but his quality of life is enormous, and he's not, as John said, he's not in hospital every few days having chemo infusions. He's taking a tablet twice a day.
Because chemo can often be like carpet bombing the system, can't it? I mean, I'm not criticising, I'm just saying at the moment, unless it's You can target to an immune response. You sort of carpet bombing, hoping you can get the response.
Senator, if you had the choice between the targeted therapy and the current reimbursed, the decision is a no-brainer.
Yeah.
And I think that you'll find even with chemotherapy, and especially with sort of rare cancers, it doesn't necessarily work, and it doesn't work with neuroendocrine cancer. So it does need more, we need more targeted treatments. And there's a lot of parallels, I think, with the group before us, with the childhood cancers, because of the patient numbers. And what we're sort of saying is, and maybe not so much with crizitinib, but we've seen other listings for neuroendocrine cancer being put on the PBS recently, which is great. But they are drugs that are already available to other cancers. We're not seeing any absolute new treatments available.
Thank you.
So, can I just clarify there too? So, are you talking about the 14 recently listed on the PBS there?
Yeah, and one of them was Afinitor, everolimus for PNET.
And so, you're saying they've already been listed for other cancers and now they've been listed again for different treatment, which is part of the problem.
Yeah.
We seem to have to go through that process again. But
Exactly, and I think that's what's come up earlier. And look, that's good because there's been clinical trials done in that, and that means there's more drugs available to our relatively small patient group. But we need to be incentivising to get new and more targeted drugs into R&D.
So we've had a number of submitters talk about incentives. So do you have a view on what that would mean? And also we've had an indication with the witnesses before you about mandating as well.
Well, interesting when they were talking about the mandating. I mean, mandating would be something that could definitely align from the paediatric also to rare cancers, full stop. And I think we should, that would be something that we would be interested in, because I think the advancements you can make in rare cancers just has an incredible knock-on effect to the common cancers. As they say, or they say now, is that all rare cancers are common and common cancers are rare, because you're looking now and really targeting the DNA. So incentive-wise, this is something that we're constantly looking at, and we're funding, as I said, a tiny little charity that we are. We're funding research, but maybe incentives through even managed access, which was again mentioned previously, and I know that it's something that the PBS has looked at. And without ever compromising the safety of patients, but getting drugs out into the market earlier, and gathering the data then, and that would really be a massive benefit to especially rare cancers. So being that incentive and sharing the risk then, and if it's then proves to be worthwhile, then the profit, not a bit of profit sharing as well. That's in the ideal world.
Mr. Bowen?
If I could just add a couple of points. There's been a suggestion by we do quite a lot of work with this Associate Professor Claire Scott at the Walter Eliza Hall Institute, and I know has put forward proposals that where there are clinical trials, that 10% of the population that is treated on that trial should be in a rare categorisation, so that there's a kind of basket there that allows it to progress forward, which always seemed to me very sensible. And I think when you talk about the difficulty in trials, and you talk about the fact that a drug can be approved for one indication but not another, then you come back to this issue of there are many drugs for common cancers that have applicability to rare cancers, but because the trials aren't done, the population groups are small, there is neither the commercial incentive from the pharmaceutical company to do that, nor is there the evidence base to go through the current PBS process. And what we believe very strongly is that we need a mechanism whereby your oncologist can say, I think there's a plausible hypothesis here that this is going to work for you as a patient, and I then have an ability to go and seek funding, seek an approval process to have it funded through the PBS in some way or other. And a very simple example of it, we actually do it with one population group, and that is veterans. If a veteran is diagnosed with a disease and an oncologist wants to treat them, they have the ability to go and apply to have that that patient treated on the patient's own merits, and there are, but we don't have it beyond veterans, and I think it's something that we, in some way, some mechanism we need, and I've got some suggestions in my submission, but there is an urgent need that just because you have rare doesn't mean you should be abandoned. You know, it's pretty self-evident.
If I could also just weigh in, we actually need to do better in terms of getting access. If part of that is that you open up the pool of patient cohorts on which you can then gain further evidence, that's to the benefit of all cancer sufferers, not just those rare cancer sufferers who have access to the drug, but to all. And the crossover benefits could well be quite meaningful in terms of research. And real-world evidence being obtained for cancer sufferers, particularly for rare cancer sufferers, because the cohort of patients is so small, needs to be encouraged. The issues are that currently, under the present guidelines and PBAC rules, PBAC aren't able to take into account some of the both social factors as well as economic factors in their determination around cost effectiveness. And those rules need to be modernised to allow earlier access, and part of that could be through a managed entry scheme arrangement where this real-world evidence is then obtained, accumulated and put back into the system for all cancer sufferers.
Thank you.
Senator Billy, can I keep going?
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to ask Ms Leyden about the survey that took place last year in regard to opportunities for consumer and consumer group input into the PBAC and the MSAC process. Can you just talk to us about that?
Yes, so that was undertaken through the Cancer Drugs Alliance, which formed in about March last year. And that was great because it brought together all the stakeholders, from the clinicians to government to the consumers and the consumer representatives. So as part of that survey, we were asked on how do we see the system improving by having a bit more of the consumer input. And I think some of the key, and I know Richard, I worked on a different work stream, but Richard could probably add to this, but
right.
the key outcomes from that is maybe looking at a expert consumer pool. Currently, we only have one consumer on the BPAC committee, or BPAC, and you know it has been actually positively taken, this recommendation from my understanding, in that you have especially within the cancer field. Having experts that people can draw on once a drug actually goes up for submission, that we can draw on expert consumers, because it can't be just about the economies, and we know that they do look at quality of life, but there could be more emphasis on that. The other main point was transparency, and I think it's come up quite a bit throughout the day, is we do put in so much effort into these submissions but don't actually find out why or it has been rejected or why not. And I think even just opening the lines of communication with consumers and consumer groups on how to make effective submissions, but also why or why not a drug wasn't passed based on the actual evidence put forward as well. I think, Richard, do you want to extend on?
Look, what we did with that was we went out to 18 different patient groups, and we asked their opinion, and then we collated the recommendations and presented them. But the key ones were, and it's an opportunity to refer back to something Senator Xenophon raised before about the Consumer Council, which was essentially what the recommendation we came with was a subcommittee as part of the PBAC. There is an economic subcommittee in the PBAC, and we thought there should be a consumer subcommittee, and that was almost unanimous within the patient group. And the power of that is twofold. One is that decisions around quality of life and values are much more strongly advocated for by people who have experienced it or have extreme empathy for the plight of patients than perhaps for people who are looking at it more from an economic or statistical perspective. we also felt that there was a need for the department to provide advice, specific advice to consumer and consumer groups on how to make presentations and how to make submissions during the PBAC process, because it's, you know, we've had patients here this morning and, you know, you think, gosh, how would they ever get through the process? Well, it's pretty simple if we can have an official inside the department whose job is to help. That doesn't seem to compromise anything, and it would seem to make good sense. And as Simone said, you know, better feedback, and we also need to collect data. And one of the things that's interesting, there's been a lot of discussion about data, and unfortunately I couldn't get the piece of legislation that I wanted to reference today, but there is, sitting over in the Department of Health, there is a massive amount of data from the medical benefits scheme, and there is a massive amount of data from the pharmaceutical benefits scheme.
And they're not synced up, you think?
And they are syncable, but they're not allowed to by legislation. And I'm happy to take on notice to provide you what the constraint is, but there is a massive data. I've spoken to people in
Why not? Why can't
privacy in some way, shape or form. I don't know, but I think it, you know, we talk about data and there is literally silos of it sitting there, and I think we need to have a good look at what we could get if we just release things, not breaching any confidentiality or patient confidentiality, but just being able to combine medicines dispensed with patient experience might just solve a few problems. And unfortunately I couldn't get quite the piece of legislation I could by 12:35 today, so I apologise, but I'm happy to provide it.
We've got the departments here soon, so...
Is that nervous laughter in the background? Or?
Can I also ask, are we able to get a copy of that survey?
Yes,
and
absolutely.
results?
Absolutely.
That would, I think, would be really
That would be
helpful
really
to us. So,
Definitely.
yeah.
And there were 17 consumer groups involved.
Yeah,
in that.
and they represent over 200,000 patients, I read.
Yes, that's correct.
I did just refresh my memory. It's not that I'm really
No,
that
that-
smart. I
We're
just
impressed.
refreshed my memory there. I also wanted to ask about the suggestions you've got around innovative access models. Are you able to talk to us a bit about that, the interim access scheme and
And
the
the
managed access program?
Yep.
Sure. So, again, as part of this working group with the Cancer Drugs Alliance, we looked at different innovative access schemes. So we looked at what was being done overseas, and obviously there is the the Cancer Drugs Fund. There has been different mistakes probably made with that, but the essence of it is that, you know, it provides an interim, and what we were stressing is these are interim models while we look at reviving or changing some parts of the PBS. So they wouldn't be there for the long term, which unfortunately I think has happened overseas. And they would be more strictly controlled. So, you know, again, there would have to be some sort of restrictions put on what drugs can go in there and how much and that sort of thing. The other things we looked at, I'm sorry, I'm just going to get my page up, was private health insurance reform. This is something I did speak with the Private Healthcare Australia on, and yes, the door is open, but obviously with anything like this, you would have to look at premiums increasing, and no one wants to do that, and especially after the last lot of premiums.
Sorry, although presumably if you have an earlier diagnosis and you get a better outcome, you
Live
think
longer
that,
and pay more.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry?
Live longer and pay more.
Well, if you get a better outcome, it can save a lot of quite traumatic treatment.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that we're constantly battling, is that, you know, if we just put a little bit more into early diagnosis, we won't have a lot of these problems at all. So that was probably not one that was something in the long term. The review of the managed access program, we definitely concluded that was something that at least could be, and is on the radar now, and could be actually, moved forward pretty quickly.
I think that's the program. Is that the program that one of the oncologists told us he didn't even know existed?
He did,
Yes,
just previously, yes.
It needs a bit more than a review, I would think, then.
In fairness, there's not that much reason why an oncologist would need to know it. It's a process that occurs between a submission from the industry to the department, and it's a highly innovative. It could be the solution to so many problems, but they would see the outcomes rather than be involved in the process.
Can you just explain to me, Mr. Vines, how it works then?
Yeah. Essentially, and I'll sort of almost quoting from how the PBAC describes it, they reach a position where they think a drug has merit, but the data does not exist that will satisfy the PBAC. So we think this is a good drug, but one example of it was Yervoy, which was a melanoma drug from last year. We think it's a good drug. You don't have the data, Mr. Industry, that should work. The data that you've given us suggests that you want a price of $10 a treatment, and we think, okay, we'll pay you $10 a treatment. We'll examine the outcomes over the next period of time. This is the layman's definition, by the way.
Yeah, no, that's good. It's the best one from me.
We'll examine the outcome, and after a period of time, I honestly don't know what that is, but I imagine it's a number of years, we'll sit down and say, well, your data said justified $10 a whack. The data that we've actually accumulated suggests it should have been $11 a whack. Here's an extra dollar. Or I think what sometimes the industry is concerned about, the data might say that it's $7 a whack, so give us back $3 a treatment. And in the rare cancer submission, we talk about an interim fund in slightly different terminology to the CDA, because what we see is if it's capable, if the PBAC is capable of saying, right now we have a gap from TGA registration to PBAC listing, and that's what we would like to cover. And if the PBAC can say, here, you don't have the data, so we'll give you $10 a whack and we'll reconcile it down the track, which is what managed entry is. What we would say is, why can't we take managed entry and bring it back here, so that instead of this period in between where patients are in limbo, where we know the drug's effective but we have no money to pay for it, we bring it back here and then we reconcile the process after it's gone through the PBAC. Where the UK Cancer Drugs Fund went wrong, in my opinion, was that it attempted to exist in parallel with the PBS. So it was almost in competition. If you couldn't get your drug listed on the PBS, then you could go off, and you don't want that. But what you want to do is cover that gap between when the TGA says it's safe and efficacious and clinicians want to prescribe it and the PBS hasn't listed it yet. And I think it's the managed entry scheme, just pick it up, put it back there, in simplistic terms, would offer some hope. You would get, and if I have to say, if the PBAC is right and the gap is only 17 weeks, then hey, it's not a big issue. But if, as industry says, well, we observe that it's 6 to 12 months or 2 years before it goes, then a lot of lives get saved and a lot of people get treated.
The ability to do that exists today. It's called conditional licensing, and it exists in the regulation. It's only the funding of it.
Senator Di Natale, do you have any questions?
I suppose I'm interested in perhaps exploring that theme a little further. I'll take you off speaker, sorry. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
So the issue of the interim approval is one that I've been interested in, but I acknowledge that there have been some mistakes made in the proposal in the UK. Can you see any way of sort of tightening that up so that we do cover the delay between a submission going in for approval and often the sort of 1 to 2 years that it can take for a drug to be approved? Do you have any sort of concrete suggestions about tightening it up so that, you know, the government of the day isn't nervous about repeating the same mistakes as occurred in the UK?
Senator, I think
that was to anybody.
Yeah, sorry. It's a bit like being spoken to by God, I have to say.
Don't get in there.
I've been called many things, but that's not one, let me tell you.
Look, I think the solution requires a bit of flexibility to get a situation where, I go back perhaps before where you were talking about where once the submission's lodged, but I think once it's registered and we know there's going to be a submission, so the TGA says it's safe, the pharmaceutical company is definitely making a submission, From that point on, we ought to be able to very simply, very easily, if we can do it, if we can run a managed entry scheme after PBAC consideration, then we ought to be able to put something in place beforehand, not that corrupts the PBS process. It's served us well for a very long time, but allows it to go through the 1 to 2 years if that's necessary, and patients still have access. The issue is not the delay. The issue is the patients who don't get it while that delay takes place.
And I think what Richard is also saying, Senator, is, and how we can tighten that is by really, again, this transparency and having proper data collection and having it as the strict guidelines around this managed access scheme, so that we are actually getting the outcomes that we're after.
So let me perhaps just ask a couple of questions to explore that. Who would make the decision to grant access or to fund the drug before PBAC approval? What sort of body were you thinking of?
At the moment, it's the department.
Yeah.
It's
but under a
the department.
proposed scheme, would you?
Yeah, my strong belief is that there needs to be a panel of clinicians who can look at the drug and say, this is effective, this is one that we need in the system in Australia today. We don't need to wait 2 years for it because we know its effectiveness, we know that it's going to work. I think that it goes back to my opening remarks, Senator, that what we need to do is get some power back in the hands of the people who know best about this, and that is clinicians.
Let me put the view of, governments are always nervous about this, and earlier we talked about having a more sort of strictly controlled process when we looked at the UK scheme. Under what you're describing, what could happen is clinicians might say, yes, we think this is likely to be listed, and we want to avoid the delay in the PBAC recommendation, so we recommend that it be made available to patients and be funded. The PBAC then has a look at it and says, well, we don't agree with that recommendation. It may, for various reasons, it doesn't satisfy the criteria that we use. You've then got a drug that's been in use for maybe a year or two, and it would then need to be, it would no longer be subsidised by government. I imagine that regardless of, who the health minister is, that they would be very nervous about a system that meant taking something away that was previously listed. Do you see that as a potential danger?
I see it as an issue, but I think that I don't think it's difficult from an economic perspective, because we would have 2 years of data about how effective the drug was, so we could, using health technology assessment methodologies, we could very easily have an arbitrated value of what should be what it was worth. I think that. Look, I think there's just going to be, if you want to have reform and you want to get things on earlier, then you've got to have a mechanism for getting them off. And I think in the PBAC submission or the Department of Health submission, they refer that it's great to have a managed entry scheme, but we also need a managed exit scheme. And we have to be realistic and adult about that and say, well, this drug's had 2 years, it didn't produce the results that were there, so it's now off the table. I can understand politically why that might be challenging, but I'm pretty sure that politics isn't meant to be easy. So therefore, it's just something they would have to deal with.
Well, perhaps let me ask you about, you go further in your submission and talk about this service model, which is a bigger reform, because it really means changing the way we assess whether governments should be funding medicines. Can you tell me a bit more about, I think you in your submission talk about it's a bit like software licensing. Can you tell me a bit more about how it would work in relation to medicines? Yeah, look, it is, with the greatest respect to myself, it probably constitutes the word thought bubble. But what I sat there and looked at it, and I think one of the aspects of having patients and consumers in
involved in the process is that they're not just patients or carers of cancer patients. They come from a different experience in life, and sometimes it's hard to see the picture if you're inside the frame. And I looked at what's going on, and I see 900 cancer drugs in development across the world, of which many hundreds will actually be realised. And I thought, how on earth do we have a system that copes with that when we're talking 15 to 20 drugs a year being approved by the current mechanisms? I think my back of the postage calculation is that there's 100 billion a year going into cancer research. So I looked at my background, which is technology, and thought, how did we deal with it? When I first started if you wanted to buy Microsoft Word a long time ago, you paid $600 at Officeworks, loaded it onto your PC, and if you got a new employee, you paid another $600, and that's how it worked. And thought, well, that's not how it works now. People treat software as a service, and you pay X dollars a month, and that gives you, Microsoft has something called an unlimited access framework, which you get the entire portfolio of their software products, and at the end of 3 or 4 years, you look at your usage, you then negotiate your next 3 to 4 years. And I thought, what would happen if, instead of going through this medicine by medicine by medicine approval process, if someone from pharmaceutical company XYZ came down to Canberra and said, I've got these 30 drugs in my portfolio, and I'm happy to license them to you, plus the cost of manufacture, for $1 million a year for the next 3 years. And I think we need to explore it. I think when technology is developing at the rate of cancer medicine technology, we've got to be brave enough to look at new models. And intellectual property licensing in one form or another seems to me to fit very well with the system, with the product or with the concept of what we've got with medicines, where you've got massive amounts of research and a very low cost of manufacture. It's exactly software, it's exactly Netflix, and it's exactly Spotify.
Interesting. And have you discussed that, broadly with members of industry, or?
I have discussed it with members of industry, and once when I've been articulate enough to explain it in a way, they've generally been interested and not dismissive. I'm pleased to say. I've discussed it at length with intellectual property lawyers. I've discussed it with intellectual property licensing experts, particularly from the software industry, and everybody immediately sees the parallels. And one of our objectives at Rare Cancers is to do a lot more work in that over the next coming years, over the next 12 months, with representatives from industry, hopefully from the department, with external experts, people who come from software or film or other IP licensed things, to try and just sit in a room and say, okay, what happens if we change this? Because right now I can tell you the biggest fear that I have is that the number of drugs and the way that they're being presented to the PBS will end up ultimately with the PBS breaking, and that would be a tragedy.
Thank you. Can I just ask one last question? Ms. Leyden, I know that your organisation has been looking at trying to get resources to at least be able to fund. I understand a lot of the organisations in this space really run on the smell of an oily rag, and often it's because someone's been personally touched by this issue. Let me ask you, Ms. Leyden, because I'm aware you're looking for funding to fund a coordinator, but I'd also ask Mr. Vines or Mr. Cannings about the level of support there is just in terms of being able to support both of your organisations, because frankly I don't think this is an issue that many of us in politics understand. We all have I think a clear understanding about the big cancer groups and the need to fund those, but I think that really important statistic that half of all cancers are rare or uncommon cancers, myself as a former clinician, that was a surprise. So, it's important. The work that you do as organisations is important. Do you receive any level of government support, and what sort of other funding do you get to be able to undertake the work that you do?
Well, thank you, Richard, and Thank you for bringing up and highlighting this, because obviously, yes, we do run off the smell of an oily rag. We receive no government funding, and we do run our own helpline, a specialist net nurse support line. It's a national service. We're a national foundation. We run our own support groups in the different hospitals or Cancer Council offices. We have actually been putting together a proposal to the Health Minister for funding, minimal in relation to in the scheme of things, but we do have 10 to 12,000 patients in Australia, and that's nothing to really, to sneeze at. It is with all rare cancers and cancers in general, but specifically in this field, it's a very complicated disease, and it isn't being serviced by the different departments or anything that is available at the moment. So we really have actually had to start up our own. We have testimonials from Cancer Council helplines saying they are actually passing on patients to us because it's something that they just cannot deal with. So it is, we literally fundraise, but it's not a sustainable model. That is why we are asking for funding, because again, it comes back to once we actually get the funding, we do a lot of research. We actually have a poster abstract coming out in the Cancer Nurses Society later on in July, showing the research we're actually doing in this field. So we're collecting data, and again, it's coming back all throughout the day, is this real need to provide evidence and collect data, which we're not really doing to the best of our ability. So we've actually taken it upon ourselves with working with the different professional groups to collect the data, to show the need. I think that's what we have to do. So that's one way we've been doing it, and I guess with us committing and starting a clinical trial is something that people it's very difficult, and clinical trials are very expensive, and we have committed over $200,000 to this particular one, and without it, unfortunately, due to being knocked back by NHMRC, without it, it wouldn't actually get off the ground. But we're looking at about 80 patients to be starting on that. Again, that's a decent sample size in this rare cancers, and across 6 institutions throughout Australia. And eventually, hopefully, with NHMRC approval, rolling that out with our friends in New Zealand as well. So it's amazing what you can do off the smell of an oily rag, but in saying that, if we weren't doing it, it wouldn't be done. And as a sustainable model, it's interesting you said, how can you give somebody, say, a drug and then take it back from them? We're worried that we're giving them a service that, has 10 contact points a day and has had about 1,400 calls since its inception last year. For us to be able to turn around and have to take that back, this service is keeping people out of emergency departments and is taking the burden off the healthcare system.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think generally I would say amen to that. It's extraordinarily difficult, and you have to be 100% committed to get it done and to get it right. The other thing that you have to be extremely, I think, transparent and clear about is that if the public, as they do, donate money, they typically donate money because they want to do something in research and they want to do something in treatment. They do not necessarily want to pay for stationery and pens. And so you have to find a source of funding that is independent, of that, and that usually means corporates. Or in the first 2 years of our operation, we've been a little better this year, but in the first 2 years it meant a lot. It meant superannuation, basically, to keep it up and going and get it going, because it's just not appropriate to be siphoning off funds, and we're totally transparent about what we take and what we don't take. And I think that what Simone's doing with her Nets nurse is something that we aspire to do, and we've started to plan and make applications for grants to set up a patient support program, because we just see so often, you'll see a patient completely lost in the system because it's rare. There is no where to go. There's no breast cancer network. There's no place that they can go and get guidance, and there's no breast care nurse for adrenocortical carcinoma. So they tend to get lost in the system a little bit, and what we want to do is provide that level of service, that level of guidance and case management, and that's one of our big goals for the next little while.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Xenophon, you had a question on notice.
Definitely on notice. A reference, I think, was made earlier to the UK Cancer Fund. On notice, so don't tell me now, don't tell the committee now, if you're in a position to tell us whether you're aware of how many patients have gone through that fund through your own research and whether there's been any outcome data in respect to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I was remiss earlier. I've had a request from Hansard for copies of opening statements from witnesses where possible. I suspect it's related to the complicated names of drugs, particularly. So if, for our current witnesses, if you do have written statements, or if you could email us, that would be appreciated. And for those that are still listening, if you've got them, could you provide us with copies too, please? Thank you. That's